They thought the overgrown land was worthless, just another burden in a life already pressed thin by medical bills and overdue taxes. But when 71-year-old Margaret Jensen stumbled over a moss-covered stone jutting from the hillside, what she and her husband Harold uncovered beneath 60 years of Montana soil wasn't just forgotten property. It was a secret so carefully buried, so deliberately hidden, it would reveal a fortune worth $250 million and change their lives forever. Before we dive into the story, make sure to smash subscribe, because tomorrow we have an extra special story for you that will blow your mind. The wind off the Flathead Range cut sharp that November morning, the kind of cold that got inside your bones and refused to leave. Margaret Jensen stood at the kitchen sink of their small farmhouse, hands submerged in soapy water, staring out the window at bare trees swaying against a colorless sky. Her reflection stared back at her, 71 years etched in every line, every shadow beneath tired eyes. Behind her, Harold sat at the table sorting through a stack of envelopes, each one a reminder of what they owed and couldn't pay. Property tax notice final, medical billing statement, past due, utility company, service interruption warning. His hands trembled slightly as he set each one down. Parkinson's had started stealing his steadiness 2 years ago, just little tremors at first, but now it was everywhere, his hands, his voice, his confidence. Margaret dried her hands on a frayed dish towel and turned to face him. The kitchen was small, warm only because they kept the thermostat at 62 and wore sweaters indoors. The linoleum had cracks that spider-webbed out from the refrigerator. The cabinets hadn't been painted since 1987, but it was theirs. Or at least it had been until the bills started piling higher than Harold's pension could reach. "How bad?" Margaret asked quietly. Harold looked up, his pale blue eyes watery behind smudged glasses. "We're 3 months behind on the property tax. If we don't pay by January, they'll start foreclosure proceedings." Margaret sank into the chair across from him. Her hip ached, the one she'd been putting off surgery for because the deductible was $4,000 they didn't have. "How much do we need?" $5,218, Harold said, voice barely above a whisper. "And that's just the taxes. Doesn't count the medical bills or the furnace repair we've been ignoring." Margaret closed her eyes and pressed her fingertips to her temples. They'd worked their whole lives, Harold as a freight manager for the railroad, Margaret as a school secretary. They'd saved what they could, lived modestly, done everything right, and somehow, at 71 and 74, they were drowning. "We could sell," Harold said, the words catching in his throat. Margaret opened her eyes. "This house?" He nodded. "It's worth maybe $160,000. We could pay everything off, move into one of those senior apartments in town. The ones with the shared kitchens and bingo on Thursdays." Margaret felt something crack inside her chest. This house held 52 years of memories. The bedroom where they'd brought their daughter home from the hospital. The back porch where Harold had taught her to ride a bike. The garden where Margaret had planted roses the summer after the funeral, after cancer took their only child at 38. She couldn't leave. Not yet. Not like this. "Let's wait," Margaret said, her voice firm despite the fear pooling in her stomach. "Something will come through. It always does." But even as she said it, she wasn't sure she believed it anymore. 3 days later, the call came. Margaret answered on the 4th ring, wiping flour from her hands. She'd been trying to stretch a 5-pound bag into 2 weeks of meals. "Hello?" A man's voice, official and distant. "Is this Margaret Jensen?" "Yes, who's calling?" "This is Donald Prav from Pritchard and Stone Attorneys at Law in Billings. I'm calling regarding the estate of Howard Jensen." Margaret frowned. "Howard, Harold's uncle." "That's correct. I'm sorry to inform you that Mr. Jensen passed away 6 weeks ago." Margaret's hand tightened on the phone. Harold hadn't spoken to Uncle Howard in over 20 years. The man had been a recluse, living somewhere in the hills outside of Whitehall. No wife, no children, just a lifetime of solitude and bitterness. "I'm sorry to hear that," Margaret said carefully. The lawyer continued. "Mr. Jensen left a will. You and Harold are the only surviving relatives. He's left you his property." Margaret's heart skipped. "Property? How much?" The lawyer paused. "It's approximately 18 acres outside of Whitehall. No structures, heavily overgrown. I'll be honest with you, Mrs. Jensen, the land hasn't been maintained in decades. It's landlocked, no road access, and the county has it assessed at about $2,000. There are also back taxes owed, roughly $800. If you'd like to claim it, you'll need to settle those." Margaret felt the flicker of hope sputter out before it even caught. "So we inherit land we can't access and more debt?" "Essentially, yes. I'm required to notify you, but most families in this situation decline the inheritance. There's no value there." Margaret thanked him, hung up, and stood in the kitchen staring at the phone. When Harold came in from checking the mail, she told him. His face went through the same cycle: hope, confusion, disappointment. "Landlocked and worthless," he muttered. "Sounds about right for Uncle Howard." But that night, as they lay in bed, neither of them could sleep. Finally, Harold spoke into the darkness. "What if we just went to look at it?" Margaret turned toward him. "Why?" "Because," Harold said slowly, "we don't have a lot of options left. Maybe there's something there we could salvage. Timber rights, mineral deposits, hell, even if we could sell it for $1,000, that's 1,000 more than we have now." Margaret thought about it. Whitehall was 30 miles away. They'd have to spend gas money. They didn't have to look at land that was probably nothing but rocks and brush. But Harold was right. They were out of options. "Okay," she said, "we'll go Saturday." Saturday came cold and grey, the sky pressing low like a bruise. Margaret packed sandwiches and a thermos of coffee, and they drove Harold's old Ford Ranger down Highway 90, past fields crusted with frost and mountains disappearing into clouds. They didn't talk much. The radio played faint country songs between bursts of static. Harold's hands shook on the wheel, but he kept them steady enough. When they reached Whitehall, they stopped at the county assessor's office. A bored clerk pulled up the property records and printed them a map. "It's out past Cemetery Road," she said, pointing with a chewed pen. "No address, just coordinates. You'll have to hike in. There's an old logging trail, but it's been closed for years." Margaret studied the map. "How far?" "Maybe a mile and a half from where the trail starts." The clerk shrugged. "Good luck. Nobody's been out there in ages." They drove until the pavement ended and the road turned to gravel, then dirt. Harold parked near a rusted chain stretched between two posts. Beyond it, a faint trail disappeared into dense forest. They got out, breath misting in the cold. Margaret pulled her coat tighter and looked at Harold. His face was pale, jaw set. "You okay?" she asked. He nodded, but his hands were trembling more than usual. "I'm fine. Let's go." They ducked under the chain and started walking. The trail was overgrown, choked with brambles and fallen branches. Pine trees towered on both sides, their tops swaying in the wind. The air smelled like wet earth and decay. Margaret's hip throbbed with every step, but she didn't complain. They walked for nearly 40 minutes before the trees began to thin. Ahead, the land opened into a clearing, or what had once been a clearing. Now it was a jungle of wild grass, berry bushes and saplings fighting for light. Stones jutted from the earth in strange formations, some natural, some not. "This is it?" Harold asked, looking around. "According to the map," Margaret said, squinting at the paper. Harold kicked at a pile of rotting wood. "There's nothing here, just dirt and weeds." Margaret walked farther into the clearing, eyes scanning the ground. She stepped carefully, testing her weight on uneven soil. Then her boot caught on something solid and she stumbled forward with a gasp. Harold rushed over. "You okay?" Margaret looked down. Half buried beneath moss and vines was a large stone, smooth and flat, too uniform to be natural. She knelt, ignoring the protest in her hip, and brushed away the moss. Carved into the stone was a single word, worn but still legible. Brennan. Harold crouched beside her. "What the hell is that?" Margaret's pulse quickened. "I don't know, but somebody put it here." They began pulling away the vines and clearing the brush. Beneath the tangle, more stones emerged, arranged in a deliberate pattern, a border, a foundation. "This was something," Margaret said, breathless. "Harold, this was a structure." They worked for over an hour, tearing at the undergrowth, their hands raw and cold. Slowly, the shape revealed itself. A low stone wall, partially collapsed, running in a rough rectangle. And at the far end, almost completely hidden beneath a hillside covered in moss and roots, was a stone archway. Margaret stood, heart hammering. "Harold, look." He turned and saw it. The archway was massive, built from cut stone blocks that had weathered but not crumbled. It was set into the hillside itself, like the entrance to a cave, but too precise, too intentional. They approached slowly, almost reverently. Vines draped over the arch like a curtain. Harold pulled them aside, and behind them, barely visible in the shadows, was a door. It was made of iron, heavy and rusted, with hinges the size of Margaret's fist. A thick layer of dirt and roots covered the lower half, but the outline was unmistakable. "What in God's name is this?" Harold whispered. Margaret reached out and touched the cold metal. Her fingers traced the edges, the seams. "This isn't a shed, Harold. This is something else, something big." They stood there for a long moment, the wind moving through the trees, the world around them silent except for the pounding of their own hearts. "We need to open it," Margaret said. Harold looked at her. "We don't have tools. We don't even know what's in there. Could be dangerous. Could be nothing." Margaret met his eyes. "Or it could be why Uncle Howard left us this land." Harold swallowed hard, then nodded. "Let's come back tomorrow. With proper equipment." That night, neither of them slept. They lay side by side in the dark, thinking about the door, the stone archway, the name carved into the ground. Brennan. Who was Brennan? And why had Uncle Howard never mentioned any of this? The next morning, Harold loaded shovels, a crowbar, bolt cutters, and 2 flashlights into the truck. Margaret packed more food, water, and a first aid kit. They didn't tell anyone where they were going. The drive felt longer this time, every mile stretched by anticipation and dread. When they reached the trail, the sky was overcast, threatening rain. They walked faster than the day before, Margaret ignoring the pain in her hip, Harold gripping the crowbar like a lifeline. When they reached the clearing, the door was exactly as they'd left it, waiting. Harold set down the tools and stared at the iron surface. "You ready?" Margaret asked. He looked at her, then at the door. "No, but let's do it anyway." They started by clearing more of the dirt and roots from around the door. It took nearly an hour, their backs aching, fingers numb. Finally, the full door was exposed. It had no handle, just a heavy iron latch held in place by a rusted padlock. Harold positioned the bolt cutters on the lock and squeezed. The metal resisted, then snapped with a loud crack that echoed through the clearing. The lock fell to the ground. Margaret and Harold stood there, breathing hard, staring at the latch. "This is it," Margaret whispered. Harold reached out and lifted the latch. It groaned, metal scraping against metal. Then he pulled. The door didn't budge. He pulled harder, muscles straining. Nothing. Margaret joined him, both of them gripping the edge and heaving with everything they had. Slowly, inch by inch, the door began to move. Rust flaked off the hinges. The gap widened. Cold air rushed out, dank and stale, carrying the smell of stone and earth and something else, something preserved. The door swung open. Behind it was darkness. Harold picked up a flashlight and clicked it on. The beam cut through the black, revealing stone steps descending into the earth. They were worn smooth, carved from solid rock, and they disappeared into a passage that seemed to go on forever. Margaret's breath caught. "Harold, this isn't just a cellar. This is a whole structure." Harold's hand shook as he held the light. "Who builds something like this and then buries it?" Margaret took the second flashlight and turned it on. Only one way to find out. They stood at the threshold, the wind pushing at their backs, the darkness pulling them forward. Margaret looked at Harold. His face was pale, eyes wide, but there was something else there too. Determination. "Together?" she asked. He nodded. "Together." They stepped inside. The temperature dropped immediately. The stone walls pressed close on both sides, damp and cold. Their footsteps echoed. The stairs went down, down, 20 steps, 30, maybe more. Margaret counted under her breath, trying to steady her nerves. At 42, the stairs ended. They stepped into a space that opened up around them, and when they shone their lights forward, they both stopped breathing. They were standing in a room, not a cave, not a cellar, but a room. The walls were smooth stone, fitted together with precision. The ceiling arched overhead, supported by thick beams, and along the walls were shelves, cabinets, furniture covered in white sheets, a table, chairs, a cast-iron stove in the corner. Margaret turned in a slow circle, her light sweeping across everything. "Harold, this is a house, an entire house built underground." Harold moved toward the stove, his light catching something metallic. He bent down and picked it up. A brass nameplate, small and tarnished. He wiped it with his thumb. "Arthur Brennan, architect and visionary. Established 1963. Margaret walked to the far wall where a large frame hung covered by a sheet. She pulled the fabric away and dust billowed into the air. Beneath it was a hand-drawn blueprint, intricate and detailed, showing multiple rooms, passages, a layout far larger than what they were seeing. "This place goes deeper," Margaret said, her voice barely above a whisper. Harold joined her, staring at the blueprint. Why would someone build this? Why hide it? Margaret didn't answer. She was already moving toward a narrow hallway that led away from the main room. Harold followed. The hallway opened into another space, smaller, lined with filing cabinets and bookshelves. Papers were stacked neatly on a desk. A kerosene lamp sat beside an old typewriter. Margaret approached the desk and picked up a leather-bound journal. The cover was embossed with initials. A.B. She opened it carefully. The pages were yellowed but intact. The handwriting was precise, almost mechanical. January 5th, 1963. Construction complete. The dwelling is sealed. Everything I've built, everything I've protected, now rests below. Let them search. Let them wonder. They will never find what I've hidden. Margaret's hands trembled as she read. Harold, listen to this. She read the entry aloud. When she finished, they looked at each other. Hidden? Harold repeated. Hidden what? Margaret flipped through more pages. The journal was filled with entries, blueprints, lists, notes about ventilation systems, water sources, food storage. Arthur Brennan hadn't just built a house underground. He'd built a fortress, a vault. And at the very back of the room, past the filing cabinets and shelves, was another door. This one was different. Steel, modern, with a combination lock built into the handle. Margaret walked toward it slowly, her flashlight beam trembling. What's behind there? Harold asked. Margaret reached out and touched the cold steel. Whatever he was hiding. Harold moved beside her and examined the lock. It's a 4-digit combination. Could be anything. Tens of thousands of possibilities. Margaret looked back at the journal still clutched in her other hand. Maybe the answer's in here. They spent the next hour reading through Arthur Brennan's entries, searching for clues, numbers, dates, anything that might unlock the door. Margaret read about his childhood, his career, his paranoia about the government, about greedy family members, about a world he felt was closing in on him. And then she found it. A single line, underlined 3 times. My sanctuary complete on the 10th day of March, 63. My true legacy waits behind the year I was born, 1928. Margaret looked at Harold. March 10th, 1963. 10:03:63. But he said the year he was born, 1928. Harold's eyes widened. Try 1928. Margaret stepped to the door and carefully dialed the numbers. 1, 9, 2, 8. She held her breath and turned the handle. It clicked. The lock disengaged. The door opened. Beyond it was another set of stairs, descending even deeper into the earth. But these stairs were different. They were lined with electric lights, dim but still glowing after 60 years, powered by some unseen source. And the walls, they weren't rough stone anymore. They were smooth, polished, lined with wooden panels. Harold and Margaret stood at the top of the stairs, staring down into a golden glow that seemed impossible, unreal. "What is this place?" Margaret whispered. Harold's voice shook. "I don't know, but we're about to find out." They descended slowly, step by careful step. The air grew warmer. The smell changed from damp earth to something else, something faint like oil and wood polish. At the bottom, they stepped into a space that stole the breath from their lungs. It was a vault. The room was large, maybe 30 feet across, with a vaulted ceiling and walls lined with shelves, cabinets, glass cases. And inside those cases, stacked on those shelves, arranged with meticulous care, was a collection beyond comprehension. Gold bars gleaming under soft light, stacks of cash bundled and labeled, velvet cases holding jewelry, diamonds, emeralds, sapphires, rows of rare coins in protective sleeves, paintings, small but exquisite, leaning against the walls, bearer bonds in sealed envelopes, and at the center of it all, a mahogany desk with a single envelope resting on top. The envelope was addressed in careful script. "To whoever finds this." Margaret's knees buckled. She grabbed Harold's arm to steady herself. "Harold," she breathed, "what is all this?" Harold couldn't speak. He could only stare, his mind unable to process the sheer magnitude of what they were seeing. Margaret moved forward on shaking legs and picked up the envelope. Her hands trembled so badly she could barely open it. Inside was a letter written on thick paper in the same precise handwriting from the journal. "If you are reading this, then I am gone. My name is Arthur Brennan. I built my fortune through architecture, investment, and a refusal to trust those who sought to take what I earned. My family betrayed me. The government hounded me, so I hid everything. Not out of greed, but out of principle. This collection represents a lifetime of work. If you have found it, then you were meant to. Perhaps you are family. Perhaps you are simply desperate enough to look where others would not. I leave it to you with one request. Do not let it destroy you the way the fear of losing it destroyed me. Use it wisely. Make it mean something." Margaret finished reading and looked up at Harold. Tears streamed down her face, not from sadness but from shock, from relief, from the impossible weight of what they'd discovered. Harold wrapped his arms around her, and they stood there in the golden light of the vault, two people who had spent their lives working, struggling, barely surviving. And now, buried beneath 60 years of Montana soil, they had found a fortune. $250 million worth of treasure, hidden by a man who trusted no one, waiting for someone who needed it most. And as they held each other in that impossible room, the door above them still open to the world, they knew nothing would ever be the same. Margaret and Harold stood frozen in the vault, their flashlight beams sweeping across shelves that seemed to glow with impossible wealth. The air was dry, carefully controlled, and everything was preserved as if Arthur Brennan had walked out yesterday instead of 60 years ago. Margaret's legs finally gave out, and she sank onto the floor, her back against the stone wall. Harold joined her, lowering himself slowly, his Parkinson's tremors worse now from adrenaline and shock. They sat in silence for a long time, just breathing, trying to make sense of what their eyes were telling them. Finally, Harold spoke, his voice hoarse. "Maggie, are we dreaming?" Margaret reached out and pinched his arm. Hard. He winced. "Ow!" She managed a shaky laugh. "Not dreaming." Harold looked around the vault again, his gaze moving from the gold bars stacked like bricks to the oil paintings leaning against the far wall. "How much do you think this is worth?" Margaret shook her head slowly. "I have no idea. Millions. Tens of millions. Maybe more." They sat there until their breathing steadied, until the shock began to fade into something else, something closer to reality. Then Margaret pushed herself to her feet, wincing as her hip protested. "We need to document everything, photograph it, understand what we're looking at." Harold stood too, gripping the edge of the mahogany desk for support. "Where do we even start?" Margaret pulled out her phone, an old model Harold had bought her 3 Christmases ago. She'd been saving it for emergencies, rarely used it because the minutes cost money. But this qualified. She began taking photos, methodical and careful. Each shelf, each case, each stack. The gold bars were arranged in precise rows, 20 bars per shelf, 6 shelves total. Margaret counted under her breath. 120 bars. Each one stamped with a weight. 400 troy ounces. Harold moved to a glass case containing jewelry. Inside were necklaces, bracelets, rings, all tagged with tiny labels in Arthur's handwriting. Edwardian diamond necklace, purchased 1951, appraised at $85,000. Art Deco emerald bracelet, estate sale 1956, value approximately $60,000. There were dozens of pieces, each one documented with the same obsessive precision. Margaret photographed them all. On the opposite wall, the paintings caught her attention. She approached slowly, almost afraid to get too close. There were 12 of them, each one small enough to carry but clearly valuable. She recognized styles, if not the artists themselves. Impressionist landscapes, abstract modernist pieces, what looked like a genuine Rothko sketch. Beside each painting was a certificate of authenticity in a protective sleeve. Harold found a wooden filing cabinet in the corner and pulled open the top drawer. Inside were neat folders, each one labeled. Bearer bonds, stock certificates, rare coins, precious metals inventory, art collection. He pulled out the bearer bonds folder with shaking hands and opened it. Inside were dozens of bonds, each one worth thousands, some worth hundreds of thousands. They were issued by banks that no longer existed, corporations that had been swallowed by mergers, but bearer bonds were as good as cash to whoever held them. "Margaret," Harold said quietly, "these alone could be worth millions." Margaret joined him and looked over his shoulder. The dates ranged from 1947 to 1962. Arthur had been accumulating wealth for decades, converting it into portable, untraceable assets and then hiding it all underground. "Why?" Margaret whispered. "Why do all this?" Harold closed the folder and opened another one labeled Personal Correspondence. Inside were letters, some typed, some handwritten, arranged chronologically. He pulled out the earliest one, dated August 1943, and began to read aloud. "Dear Arthur, I'm writing to inform you that Father has changed his will again. He's leaving everything to Thomas and cutting you out entirely. He says you're too difficult, too stubborn, that you'll waste the family fortune on your ridiculous building projects. I'm sorry, brother. I tried to reason with him. Your sister Caroline." Harold looked up at Margaret. "Family trouble." Margaret nodded slowly. "Keep reading." Harold pulled out more letters. The story emerged piece by piece. Arthur Brennan, born in 1928 to a wealthy East Coast family, had been an architectural prodigy. But he was also stubborn, independent, unwilling to follow the path his father wanted. His father had been a banker, his older brother Thomas groomed to take over the family business. Arthur had wanted to design buildings, create something lasting. The letters grew more bitter over the years. Thomas writing to tell Arthur he wasn't welcome at their mother's funeral. Caroline begging Arthur to reconcile with the family before it was too late. And then, in 1953, a legal notice. Arthur had been officially disinherited, shut out completely. But the letters didn't stop there. In 1954, Arthur had started his own architectural firm in San Francisco. Within 5 years, he was designing buildings for major clients, earning substantial fees. And he'd invested wisely, buying stocks, bonds, real estate. By 1960, he was wealthy in his own right, wealthier than his family had ever expected. And then the threats started. Margaret found a folder labeled Legal Threats and Disputes. Inside were letters from Thomas, now running the family bank, demanding Arthur pay back money he claimed Arthur had stolen years ago. There was no theft, just bitter accusations. But Thomas had hired lawyers. There were also letters from the Internal Revenue Service, questioning Arthur's tax filings, demanding audits. Arthur's responses were detailed, meticulous, proving every deduction, every expense. But the harassment continued. In 1962, Arthur had sold his firm, liquidated his real estate holdings, and converted everything to portable assets: gold, art, bonds, jewelry, and then he'd disappeared. Margaret sat down at the mahogany desk and opened Arthur's journal, the same one she'd found upstairs, but now reading more carefully. The entries from late 1962 painted a picture of a man unraveling. November 4th, 1962. Thomas has hired private investigators. They're following me, questioning my clients, trying to prove I've hidden assets to avoid taxes. The IRS is in his pocket. I can't trust anyone. December 18th, 1962. I've purchased the land in Montana. 18 acres, remote, landlocked. No one will think to look there. I'll build something permanent, something hidden. They'll never find what's mine. January 2nd, 1963. Construction begins. I've hired men from out of state, paid them cash, sworn them to secrecy. They think they're building a bunker. They have no idea. February 28th, 1963. The structure is nearly complete. Ventilation system operational. Water source secured from an underground spring. Climate control installed. This will preserve everything indefinitely. March 10th, 1963. It's finished. Everything I've worked for is now safe. Tomorrow, I seal the entrance. The world thinks I'm paranoid. Let them think what they want. I know the truth. Power corrupts, and those in power will take everything if you let them. Margaret looked up from the journal, her eyes wet. He was so alone. Harold nodded. And so angry. They spent the next hour going through more of Arthur's belongings. They found photographs in a wooden box. Arthur as a young man, handsome and serious, standing beside architectural models. Arthur shaking hands with city officials at building dedications. Arthur alone in his office, surrounded by blueprints. There were no photos of family, no weddings, no children, just work, just buildings. In another box, they found newspaper clippings, obituaries. Caroline Brennan passed away in 1967. Thomas Brennan died in 1971. Both deaths had occurred long after Arthur sealed his vault. He'd outlived them all, alone in his underground fortress. But when did Arthur die? Margaret asked. They searched for more clues. In the back of a drawer, Harold found a small leather wallet. Inside was Arthur's driver's license, expired in 1978, and behind it, a death certificate. Arthur Maxwell Brennan. Date of death, September 14, 1976. Place of death, Whitehall, Montana. Cause of death, heart failure. Age, 48. Margaret felt her chest tighten. He was only 48. Harold read further. Arthur had been found in the small cabin he maintained on the surface, about a mile from this location. He'd lived alone, had no visitors, paid his taxes in cash. When he died, the county had handled the burial, a simple grave in the Whitehall Cemetery. His will, filed with the county, left his surface property to his nearest living relative, listed as Howard Jensen of Flathead County. "Uncle Howard," Margaret whispered. Harold nodded. Uncle Howard was Arthur's cousin, maybe second cousin. Probably the only family Arthur had left who hadn't betrayed him. But the will never mentioned this place. Arthur kept the vault a secret, even in death. Margaret looked around the room again, seeing it differently now. This wasn't just a hiding place. It was a tomb. Arthur had built it, filled it with his life's work, and then died without ever telling anyone. He'd trusted it would remain hidden forever, or until someone like them stumbled upon it. What happens next will turn this night upside down, reveal a truth nobody expected, and remind us why sometimes the quietest voices carry the most power. Stay tuned to see what happens next. If you're enjoying the story, please like, share, and subscribe for more. Margaret carefully placed the death certificate back in the wallet. We need to figure out if this is actually ours, Harold. Legally. Harold rubbed his face, exhausted. Arthur's will left the surface property to Uncle Howard. Uncle Howard left that property to us. But Arthur never mentioned the vault, never mentioned what was underneath. Margaret thought carefully. So either Arthur didn't include it in his will because he wanted it to stay hidden forever, or he assumed whoever owned the land would eventually own whatever was under it. Either way, Harold said slowly, we're standing on property we legally inherited. Everything under that property should be ours too. But we need a lawyer. Margaret nodded. A good one. They spent another hour documenting everything, taking hundreds of photos, making notes, trying to create an accurate inventory. Margaret found a ledger in one of the filing cabinets, and her hands trembled as she opened it. Inside, Arthur had catalogued everything with terrifying precision. Gold bars, 120 total, 400 troy ounces each, 48,000 troy ounces total. Current market value estimated at $78 million. The number hit Margaret like a fist. $78 million in gold alone. She kept reading. Art collection, 12 pieces, authenticated value range between 100,000 and 15 million per piece. Conservative total estimate, 45 million. Bearer bonds, various issues, face value 12 million, current redemption value estimated 16 million. Rare coin collection, approximately 2,000 individual coins, estimated total value 8 million. Jewelry and precious stones, 67 pieces, conservative estimate 22 million. The numbers blurred together. Margaret's hand shook so badly she had to set the ledger down. She did the math in her head, then rechecked it, certain she'd made a mistake. She hadn't. 78 plus 45 plus 16 plus 8 plus 22. 169 million. And that didn't include the cash. Stacks of bills from the 1950s and 60s that were probably worth more than their face value to collectors. Harold leaned over her shoulder and saw the numbers. His face went white. Sweet Jesus. Margaret closed the ledger and looked at him. Harold, we're standing in a vault worth close to $200 million. Maybe more. Harold sat down heavily on the floor. His hands shook uncontrollably now, not just from Parkinson's but from shock. What do we do, Maggie? What the hell do we do with this? Margaret's mind raced. They couldn't just load it all into their Ford Ranger and drive home. They couldn't walk into a bank and deposit 78 million in gold bars. They couldn't tell anyone without risking everything, their safety, their claim, their lives. We take this slow, Margaret said, her voice steadier than she felt. We document everything, which we're doing. Then we go home and we find a lawyer we can trust. Someone who specializes in estates, probate, maybe tax law. We tell them the situation and we figure out the legal path. But Harold, we can't tell anyone else. Not neighbors, not friends, not even distant family. Not until we know exactly where we stand. Harold nodded slowly. What if someone comes looking? What if Arthur's old family has descendants who try to claim this? Margaret picked up the death certificate again. According to this, Arthur died in 1976. It's been almost 50 years. Any claims his family might have had are long past statute of limitations. And besides, they abandoned him. They're the reason he built this place. But we don't know for sure until we talk to a lawyer, Harold said. Exactly, Margaret agreed. So we lock this place back up, we hike out, and we start making calls. Harold looked around the vault one more time. How do we even sleep tonight knowing this is here? Margaret managed a tired smile. We don't. They carefully closed all the drawers and cabinets, making sure everything was exactly as they'd found it. Margaret took a final set of photos, capturing the layout, the lighting system, the ventilation grates near the ceiling. Then they walked back through the underground home, past the kitchen with its 1960s appliances, past the living area with its covered furniture, past the office with Arthur's typewriter still sitting on the desk. When they reached the stone steps leading up to the iron door, Margaret stopped and looked back. "Goodbye, Arthur," she said softly. "Thank you for trusting us with this." They climbed the stairs, emerged into the clearing where the sun was now low on the horizon, and carefully closed the iron door. Harold replaced the latch and picked up the broken padlock. "We need a new lock," he said. "A good one." They stopped at a hardware store on the way home and bought the strongest padlock they could find, along with a heavy chain. Harold's hands shook so badly at the register that he dropped his credit card twice. The clerk gave him a sympathetic look. "Rough day?" "You have no idea," Harold muttered. Back at the property, they secured the door with the new lock and disguised the entrance again with brush and vines. By the time they finished, it looked untouched, forgotten. They drove home in silence, both of them exhausted, overwhelmed, afraid to speak in case saying it out loud made it somehow less real or more dangerous. That night, Margaret sat at their kitchen table with her laptop, searching for attorneys. She needed someone discreet, someone experienced, someone far enough away that word wouldn't spread through their small town. She found a firm in Billings, Richardson and Cole that specialized in estate law and complex probate cases. One of the partners, a woman named Diane Richardson, had a long list of credentials and a reputation for handling sensitive matters. Margaret bookmarked the site. In the bedroom, Harold lay awake staring at the ceiling. His mind wouldn't stop spinning. What if someone had followed them? What if Arthur had told someone about the vault years ago and that person was still alive, still looking? What if the government seized everything, claiming Arthur had evaded taxes? What if they ended up in legal battles that cost everything they'd found? The next morning, Margaret called Diane Richardson's office. The receptionist was polite but firm. "Mrs. Richardson's schedule is completely booked for the next 3 weeks. Margaret took a breath. "Please tell her it's urgent. It involves a significant estate discovery with complicated legal implications. I'm willing to pay whatever consultation fee is necessary." There was a pause. "Hold, please." 2 minutes later, a woman's voice came on the line, warm but professional. "This is Diane Richardson. My assistant says you have an urgent estate matter." "Yes," Margaret said carefully. "My husband and I recently inherited property in Whitehall. While inspecting it, we discovered a substantial collection of assets that the previous owner apparently concealed before his death in 1976. We need to understand our legal rights and obligations." "How substantial are we talking?" Diane asked. Margaret glanced at Harold, who was listening from across the table. "Conservatively, over $150 million. The line went quiet for a long moment. "Mrs. Jensen, I can see you tomorrow at 9 a.m. Bring every piece of documentation you have. And Mrs. Jensen, yes, don't discuss this with anyone else. Not family, not friends, not your pastor. Not until we've established your legal position. Understood?" "Understood," Margaret said. They met Diane Richardson the next morning in her office on the 10th floor of a building in downtown Billings. Diane was in her mid-50s, sharp-eyed, with grey-streaked hair pulled back in a neat bun. She gestured them to seats in front of her mahogany desk and waited. Margaret and Harold spent the next hour telling her everything. The inheritance from Uncle Howard, the overgrown property, the stone archway and iron door, the underground dwelling, Arthur Brennan's journal, the vault, the inventory. Diane listened without interrupting, occasionally making notes on a legal pad. When they finished, she sat back in her chair. "May I see your documentation?" Margaret opened her bag and pulled out printouts of the photos, copies of Arthur's death certificate, Uncle Howard's will, the property deed, and pages from Arthur's ledger. Diane examined everything carefully, her expression unreadable. Finally, she looked up. "First, the good news. Based on what you've shown me, you have a legitimate legal claim to this property and everything on it or under it. Your Uncle Howard inherited it from Arthur Brennan through a properly executed will. Howard left it to you through his will. The chain of title is clean." Harold exhaled. "And the bad news?" Diane tapped her pen on the desk. "The bad news is that a discovery of this magnitude will attract attention. The IRS will want to know if estate taxes were properly paid when Arthur died. The state of Montana will want to verify that all property taxes are current. And if Arthur has any surviving relatives, even distant ones, they may try to contest your claim." Margaret's stomach tightened. "What do we do?" Diane leaned forward. "First, we establish a legal foundation. I'll file the necessary paperwork to formally document the discovery and your ownership claim. Second, we bring in a tax attorney to review Arthur's estate and determine what, if any, taxes are owed. Third, we hire a professional appraiser to create an official valuation. You'll need that for insurance purposes alone." Harold blinked. "Insurance?" Diane smiled slightly. "Mr. Jensen, you're now the custodian of what may be one of the largest private collections of gold and art in the state. You need insurance. You also need security. Have you considered that someone might try to steal it?" Margaret and Harold looked at each other, the color draining from their faces. "We hadn't thought that far," Margaret admitted. Diane made another note. "I'll recommend a security consultant. You'll need cameras, alarms, possibly even private security depending on how public this becomes. And it will become public eventually. These things always do." "How long do we have before that happens?" Harold asked. Diane considered. "If we move quickly and quietly, we might have a few weeks, maybe a couple of months. But once you start liquidating assets, applying for insurance, having items appraised, word will spread. Wealthy collectors talk, auction houses gossip. It's inevitable." Margaret felt the walls closing in. "All we wanted was to see if the land was worth anything." Diane's expression softened. "I understand, but you've stumbled into something extraordinary. And with extraordinary wealth comes extraordinary responsibility and extraordinary risk." They left Diane's office 3 hours later with a plan, a list of contacts, and a retainer agreement that cost them $5,000 they didn't have. Diane had agreed to defer payment until they could liquidate some of Arthur's assets. The first step was a complete professional appraisal. Diane had already made calls. By the end of the week, a team would travel to the site. An art appraiser from Denver, a precious metals expert from Seattle, and a rare coin specialist from Minneapolis. They would inventory everything, verify authenticity, and provide written valuations. On the drive home, Harold gripped the steering wheel with white knuckles. "Maggie, what if this all falls apart? What if we lose everything?" Margaret stared out the window at the passing landscape. "Then we're right back where we started, broke, behind on taxes, and worried about losing the house. But Harold, we have a chance here, a real chance to change our lives." Harold's voice cracked. "I'm scared. I'm 74 years old and my hands won't stop shaking and I'm scared." Margaret reached over and covered his trembling hand with hers. "I'm scared too, but we're doing this together." That night, Margaret couldn't sleep. She lay in bed thinking about Arthur Brennan, alone in his underground fortress, surrounded by wealth but utterly isolated. He'd protected his treasure from a world he didn't trust, and in doing so, he'd lost everything that mattered. She thought about the warning in his letter. "Do not let it destroy you the way the fear of losing it destroyed me." She sat up carefully, trying not to wake Harold, and walked to the kitchen. She poured herself a glass of water and stood at the window, looking out at the dark shapes of trees against the night sky. Somewhere out there, 30 miles away, a vault filled with gold and art sat waiting in the darkness, and she and Harold were the only ones who knew. The weight of that secret pressed down on her like a stone, and then she heard it. A sound outside, soft, deliberate. Footsteps on gravel. Margaret's heart stopped. She set down the glass and moved to the window, peering through the curtain. A shadow moved across the driveway. Someone was out there, walking slowly toward the house, watching. Margaret's breath froze in her lungs. The shadow moved again, closer now, crossing from the driveway toward the porch. Her hand trembled as she reached for her phone on the counter, fingers fumbling to unlock the screen. Behind her, she heard the bedroom door creak open. Harold appeared in the hallway, his voice thick with sleep. "Maggie, what's wrong?" She held up her hand, signaling him to be quiet, and pointed toward the window. Harold's eyes widened. He grabbed the baseball bat they kept by the front door, a relic from when their daughter played softball 30 years ago. The footsteps stopped. Margaret held her breath, counting the seconds. 5, 10, 15. Then came a soft knock on the door. Not aggressive, not threatening, almost hesitant. Margaret and Harold exchanged glances. Harold positioned himself beside the door, bat raised. Margaret moved to the side window where she could see the porch at an angle. In the dim light from the street lamp, she could make out a figure. A man, older, wearing a worn canvas jacket and a baseball cap. He looked nervous, glancing over his shoulder. "Margaret?" The voice was familiar. Margaret's heart was still racing, but she recognized it now. She unlocked the door and opened it a crack. The chain still latched. "Earl?" Earl Davidson stood on her porch, hat in his hands now, looking sheepish and worried all at once. He'd been their neighbor for 20 years before moving to town after his wife died. "I'm sorry to come by so late," he said quietly. "I saw your lights on and I needed to talk to you." Harold lowered the bat slowly. "Earl, it's almost midnight." Earl nodded. I know, but this couldn't wait. Can I come in? Just for a minute?" Margaret looked at Harold. He shrugged, still wary. She unlatched the chain and opened the door. Earl stepped inside, his boots leaving small clumps of dirt on the floor. He looked around nervously, as if checking to see if anyone else was there. Margaret crossed her arms. "What's this about, Earl?" Earl twisted his cap in his hands. "There's talk in town. About you two. About some kind of discovery out on that land you inherited?" Margaret's blood went cold. "What kind of talk?" Earl shifted his weight. "I was at Thompson's this afternoon getting feed. Jerry mentioned he saw you and Harold at the hardware store buying a heavy-duty lock and chain. Said Harold's hands were shaking so bad he could barely hold his wallet. Then Sarah from the county assessor's office told her sister you'd been asking about property out near Whitehall. People are putting two and two together." Harold's jaw tightened. "And coming up with what?" Earl looked uncomfortable. "Some folks think you found something valuable. Maybe old mining equipment, maybe something else. There's rumors about that land, always has been. Stories about the guy who owned it being some kind of hermit millionaire." Margaret felt her pulse hammering in her temples. "Who's talking about this, Earl?" "Who exactly?" Earl looked down at his boots. "Pretty much everyone at Thompson's yesterday. And you know how small towns are. Word spreads. By now, half the county probably knows you're up to something." The room fell silent, except for the ticking of the clock on the wall. Harold finally spoke, his voice tight. "Why are you here, Earl? Are you trying to warn us, or are you fishing for information?" Earl looked up, and Margaret saw genuine concern in his eyes. "I'm warning you, because I've known you both for a long time, and because when people start talking about money, things can get ugly. There's folks in this town who are struggling bad, worse than you know, And desperate people do desperate things. You need to be careful." Margaret's hands were shaking now too. "We appreciate the warning." Earl put his cap back on. "There's something else." This afternoon, a man came into Thompson's asking questions. City guy, nice suit, looked out of place. He was asking about property sales in Whitehall, about the Brennan name. Said he was doing genealogical research. Margaret's stomach dropped. What did he look like? Tall, maybe 50, dark hair going grey, expensive watch. Talked real smooth. Earl paused. He left his card with Jerry, said if anyone knew anything about Arthur Brennan's estate to call him. Jerry told him to mind his own business, but that's not going to stop everyone. Margaret and Harold stood frozen as Earl moved toward the door. "Just watch yourselves," he said quietly. "And maybe think about getting better locks on these doors too." After he left, Margaret locked the door and pressed her forehead against it. "Harold, this is happening too fast." Harold set the bat down, his hands shaking worse than before. "Who was that man?" "Could be a lawyer," Margaret said, her mind racing. "Could be a distant relative of Arthur's. Could be anyone." Harold moved to the window and looked out at the empty street. "What do we do?" Margaret straightened up, something hardening in her chest. "We call Diane Richardson first thing in the morning, and we move faster than we planned." The next morning, Diane's voice on the phone was calm but firm. "This is exactly what I was afraid of. Once word gets out, even rumors, people come looking. Who else knows about the vault?" "Just you," Margaret said. "And the appraisers you're sending." Diane was quiet for a moment. "The appraisers are under strict NDA. They won't talk. But you need to understand, once we start the formal legal process, it becomes public record. Anyone can file a claim or challenge your ownership." "How long do we have?" Harold asked. He was on speakerphone, sitting beside Margaret at the kitchen table. "Days, maybe a week," Diane said. "I'm going to expedite everything. The appraisal team arrives tomorrow. They'll work fast. In the meantime, I'm filing a quiet title action to establish your clear ownership. That should head off most challenges. But Mrs. Jensen, Mr. Jensen, you need to consider security. Now." Margaret closed her eyes. "Can you recommend someone?" Diane rattled off a name and number. "His name is Frank Mercado. He's ex-military, runs a private security firm. He's discreet and he's good. Tell him I sent you." That afternoon, Frank Mercado drove up in a black Suburban. He was mid-40s, built like a linebacker, with sharp eyes that missed nothing. Margaret and Harold met him in the driveway. "Diane Richardson says you need security," Frank said. No preamble. He looked around the property, noting the sightlines, the lack of fencing, the isolated location. "She's right. You're exposed here." Harold bristled slightly. "We've lived here for 30 years without security." Frank's expression didn't change. "You didn't have 200 million reasons to need it before." They drove out to the Whitehall property together. Frank didn't ask what was hidden there, didn't pry. He just walked the perimeter, examined the terrain, studied the approaches. When they showed him the concealed entrance, he nodded slowly. Whoever built this knew what they were doing. But concealment isn't security. Anyone who's looking hard enough will find it. "What do you recommend?" Margaret asked. Frank pulled out a tablet and started making notes. "Cameras, motion sensors, perimeter alarms. I can have a basic system installed in 48 hours, but you're going to need more than electronics. You need people." "How many people?" Harold asked. Frank looked at the surrounding forest. 2-person rotating shifts, 24/7. That's 4 people total, working in pairs. It's not cheap. Harold and Margaret exchanged glances. "How much?" Frank quoted a number that made Harold's face go pale. "We can't afford that," he said quietly. Frank looked at them both. "With respect, you can't afford not to. You're sitting on a fortune. Every hour it sits unguarded is an hour someone could break in and take it." Margaret thought about the man in the suit asking questions at Thompson's. She thought about Earl's warning. "Do it," she said. Harold started to protest, but she cut him off. "Harold, we'll figure out the money. Diane said we can liquidate some assets quickly. We can't risk losing everything because we were too cheap to protect it." Frank nodded. "I'll have my team here by tomorrow night." The next day, the appraisal team arrived. 3 specialists, each one an expert in their field. They worked methodically, professionally, documenting every item in the vault with photographs, measurements, and detailed notes. The art appraiser, a woman named Catherine Chen from Denver, spent hours examining each painting with a jeweler's loupe and a portable ultraviolet light. When she finished with the 4th painting, her hands were trembling. "Mrs. Jensen," she said quietly, "this is a genuine Rothko. Early work, probably 1951 or 52. Conservatively, it's worth $12 million. Margaret felt dizzy. $12 million? For that? Catherine smiled slightly. There are only a few hundred authenticated Rothko works in existence. This is museum quality. The precious metals expert, a man named David Ross from Seattle, examined the gold bars with electronic instruments and reference books. When he finished his assessment, he looked up at Margaret and Harold with something like awe. "These are all authenticated. Various mints, various years, but all genuine. Current market value for gold is approximately $1,900 per troy ounce. You have 48,000 troy ounces here." He paused. "That's $91,200,000 in gold alone." Harold sat down hard on the floor. The rare coin specialist, an older gentleman named Robert Fields from Minneapolis, worked for 2 days straight, barely stopping to eat. When he finally emerged from his examination, his face was flushed with excitement. "I've been collecting and appraising coins for 43 years, he said. "I've never seen a private collection like this. You have coins here that I thought were lost. There's an 1864 Indian head cent in near mint condition. There's a 1793 chain cent. There's a 1913 Liberty Head nickel." Margaret blinked. "Is that good?" Robert laughed, a short burst of disbelief. "Good? Mrs. Jensen, the 1913 Liberty Head nickel is one of the rarest coins in American history. Only 5 are known to exist. The last one that sold at auction went for $4.5 million. The room spun. Margaret grabbed the edge of the desk to steady herself. By the end of the 3rd day, the appraisers had completed their work. Catherine, David, and Robert sat with Margaret and Harold in the underground office, their laptops open, their faces serious. Catherine spoke first. "Total valuation for the art collection, authenticated and cross-referenced with auction records and museum acquisitions, $48,300,000. David went next. Precious metals, gold bars, and bullion, $91,200,000. Jewelry and gemstones, $26,400,000. Robert adjusted his glasses. Rare coins, verified and graded, $12,700,000. Bearer bonds, Margaret added, reading from Arthur's ledger. 16 million. Cash, various denominations, some collectible, approximately 3,200,000. Catherine pulled up a spreadsheet. Total conservative valuation, $197,800,000. Harold made a sound like he'd been punched. Catherine continued, "That's conservative. If you sold everything at auction with proper marketing and authentication, you could exceed 250 million. The number hung in the air like a physical thing, heavy and impossible. Margaret heard it but couldn't process it. Her brain refused to accept that she and Harold, who 3 weeks ago were worried about $5,000 in property taxes, were now sitting on $250 million. After the appraisers left, Margaret and Harold sat alone in the vault. The security team Frank had hired was stationed outside, 2 men with radios and weapons protecting a secret that was no longer quite so secret. Harold's voice was hoarse. "What do we do with this, Maggie?" "I don't know," Margaret whispered. That night, back at their house, Margaret couldn't sleep again. She sat at the kitchen table with Arthur's journal, reading his entries from the final months of his life. June 2nd, 1976. I've been feeling tired lately. Pain in my chest. I should see a doctor, but I don't trust them. Don't trust anyone. July 15th, 1976. The pain is worse. I've written a new will, leaving the surface property to Cousin Howard. He's the only family who never asked me for anything. But the vault, I can't include it. If I do, they'll find it. Taxes will consume it. Lawyers will fight over it. Better to let it sleep. Let fate decide who finds it. August 23rd, 1976. I've realized something. I built this place to protect my wealth from people I didn't trust. But in doing so, I've spent 30 years alone, underground, surrounded by treasure I can't enjoy. I've become a ghost guarding gold. Was it worth it? I don't know anymore. September 1st, 1976. If someone finds this after I'm gone, I hope they're different than me. I hope they use it for something good. I built a fortress. Maybe they'll build a life. That was the last entry. 13 days later, Arthur was dead. Margaret closed the journal, tears running down her face. She understood now. Arthur hadn't just left them money. He'd left them a choice. Become like him, paranoid and isolated, or become something better. The next morning brought more problems. Diane called, her voice tight. "We have a situation." "What now?" Margaret asked, exhausted. "A man named Thomas Brennan III has filed a claim with the probate court. He says he's Arthur Brennan's great-nephew and that Arthur's estate was never properly settled. He's demanding the vault be frozen until the court determines rightful ownership." Margaret's heart sank. "Can he do that?" "He's doing it," Diane said. "I've got his filing right here. He's hired a firm out of Boston. They're aggressive." "How strong is his case?" Margaret heard papers rustling. "Not very. Arthur's will was clear, and the chain of title from Arthur to Howard to you is documented. But he doesn't need a strong case. He just needs to create enough doubt to force a settlement, or to drag this out so long that you can't afford to fight." Margaret's hands clenched into fists. "We are not settling." "Good," Diane said, "because I wasn't going to let you. We fight this, but it's going to cost money and time." That afternoon, a reporter showed up at their house. Margaret saw the news van pull up, and her stomach dropped. She didn't answer the door, but the reporter, a young woman with perfect hair and a microphone, stood on the porch anyway. "Mrs. Jensen, we've heard reports of a significant historical discovery on property you own. Can you comment?" Margaret stayed inside, curtains drawn. The reporter tried for 10 minutes, then left. But Margaret knew she'd be back. That night, Harold had a panic attack. Margaret found him in the bathroom, hyperventilating, tears streaming down his face. "I can't do this," he gasped. "It's too much, Maggie. It's too much." She held him, rocking him like a child until his breathing slowed. "I know," she whispered. "I know it is." The next few days were a blur of phone calls, legal documents, and mounting pressure. Thomas Brennan III went on record with the Boston Globe, claiming his family had been cheated out of their rightful inheritance. The story went national. Suddenly, Margaret and Harold's phone rang constantly. Reporters, distant relatives they'd never heard of, people claiming to be Arthur's friends, all wanting a piece of the story or the fortune. Diane hired a publicist to handle the media. Frank Mercado increased security, and Margaret and Harold stopped sleeping more than a few hours a night. 1 week after the appraisal, Margaret sat at the kitchen table at 3 a.m, staring at a letter that had arrived in the mail. It was from a woman in Florida claiming to be Arthur's daughter from a secret relationship. She demanded a DNA test and a share of the estate. Margaret set the letter down and put her head in her hands. Harold found her there an hour later. He sat beside her without speaking, just taking her hand in his trembling one. "Is it worth it?" Margaret asked quietly. "All of this?" Harold was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I've been thinking about Arthur's last journal entry, about how he realized too late that protecting his money cost him everything that mattered." Margaret looked at him. "And?" Harold's eyes were wet. "We can't become him, Maggie. We can't let this destroy us the way it destroyed him. But we also can't just give up and let people take what's legally ours." "So what do we do?" Margaret asked. Harold squeezed her hand. "We decide what kind of people we want to be. And then we do that, no matter what it costs." Margaret thought about that. She thought about the bills they still couldn't pay. She thought about the fortune sitting in the vault. She thought about Arthur, alone and afraid, dying at 48 with all his wealth and no one to share it with. The next morning, she called Diane. "I want to set up a meeting with Thomas Brennan III. Diane was surprised. "You want to negotiate?" "No," Margaret said. "I want to look him in the eye and understand what he's really after." Diane arranged it. 3 days later, Margaret and Harold sat in a conference room in Diane's office. Across from them sat Thomas Brennan III, a man in his mid-50s with silver hair and an expensive suit. His lawyers flanked him, 2 sharks in designer ties. Thomas spoke first, his voice smooth and practiced. "I appreciate you agreeing to meet. I think we can resolve this situation amicably." "What do you want?" Harold asked bluntly. Thomas smiled. "I think that's obvious. My great-uncle Arthur was not of sound mind when he made his estate decisions. He was paranoid, possibly mentally ill. Any reasonable court will see that his assets should have been distributed among his surviving family members, not hidden away." Margaret leaned forward. "And you're a surviving family member?" Thomas's smile tightened. "I am. My grandfather was Arthur's brother, Thomas Sr. They had a falling out, yes, but blood is blood." Harold's voice was cold. "Your grandfather was one of the people who drove Arthur into hiding. He threatened him, harassed him, tried to have him audited by the Iris. I've read the letters." Thomas's lawyers shifted uncomfortably. Thomas himself didn't flinch. "That's ancient history. What matters now is that a vast fortune is sitting in your possession and you have no right to it." Margaret pulled out a folder. Inside were copies of Arthur's journal entries, his letters, his final message. She slid them across the table. "Read these." Thomas glanced at his lawyers, then began reading. Margaret watched his face. She saw the moment he got to Arthur's words about his family, about the betrayal, about his wish that whoever found the vault would be different, would be better. When Thomas finished, he pushed the papers back across the table. "Very moving, but it doesn't change the law." Margaret's voice was steady. "You don't care about Arthur. You don't care about what he wanted or what he suffered. You just want money." Thomas's mask slipped for a moment. His eyes went hard. "You're damn right I want money. Do you have any idea what my family went through? Arthur was selfish and stubborn. He chose to cut us out. That doesn't mean we should suffer for it." Harold stood up. "This meeting is over." Thomas stood too, straightening his suit. "You can't win this. I have resources, connections, lawyers who do this for a living. You're 2 old people who can barely pay your own bills." Margaret stood slowly, her hip aching. "You're right. We can barely pay our bills. 3 weeks ago we were worried about losing our home." She paused. "But Arthur chose us. Not because we're rich or connected or powerful, because we needed it. And because maybe, just maybe, he trusted we'd do the right thing with it." She picked up the folder. "You're not getting a penny." Thomas's face flushed red. "You'll regret this. We'll see you in court." Diane's voice cut through the tension. "And we'll win. Now get out of my office." After they left, Margaret sank into her chair, exhausted. Diane closed the door and sat across from them. "That was brave." Margaret shook her head. "That was terrifying. But necessary," Diane said. "Now he knows you won't fold. The fight is going to get uglier, but you've drawn your line." That night, Margaret and Harold stood in the vault for what felt like the 100th time. But this time, They weren't cataloguing or documenting or appraising. They were just standing there, surrounded by wealth they'd never imagined, feeling the weight of every decision pressing down on them. Harold broke the silence. "If we win this legal fight, what do we do with it all?" Margaret thought about Arthur's last words. Use it for something good. She thought about their own struggles, their daughter's medical bills that had drained their savings before she died. She thought about Earl Davidson's warning that people in town were struggling worse than they knew. She looked at Harold. What if we didn't keep it all? Harold's eyebrows rose. What? Margaret's voice grew stronger as the idea took shape. What if we kept enough to secure our future, pay our bills, live comfortably, and used the rest to help people, really help them? Harold stared at her. Maggie, this is $250 million we're talking about. Exactly, Margaret said. More money than we could ever spend. More than we'd even know what to do with. But it could change lives, hundreds of lives, maybe thousands. Harold was quiet for a long time. Then, slowly, he began to nod. A foundation, he said, like the big philanthropists do. Margaret smiled, feeling something lift from her chest for the first time in weeks. Yes, the Brennan Foundation, helping people who need it most. Harold's trembling hands reached for hers. Arthur wanted his money to mean something, wanted it to be used for good. Margaret squeezed his hands gently. Then let's make sure it does. And in that moment, surrounded by gold and art and precious stones, they stopped being victims of an overwhelming discovery and became something else entirely. They became guardians of a legacy that was bigger than wealth, bigger than their own fears, bigger than the small lives they'd been living. They became what Arthur Brennan had hoped for but never believed possible. They became proof that sometimes the right people do find the treasure. And sometimes, against all odds, they know exactly what to do with it. The fluorescent lights hummed softly above them. Outside, Frank Massado's security team kept watch in the darkness. Somewhere in Boston, Thomas Brennan III was planning his next move. Somewhere in Billings, Diane Richardson was preparing for the legal battle ahead. And in that underground vault, built by a man too afraid to trust the world, Margaret and Harold Jensen stood hand in hand, no longer afraid, because they'd finally understood the truth. The treasure wasn't what would destroy them. The fear of losing it was. And they were done being afraid. The courtroom in Billings was smaller than Margaret had imagined. She'd expected something grand, imposing, like the courtrooms on television. Instead, it was plain, functional, with worn wooden benches and fluorescent lights that buzzed faintly. She sat beside Harold in the second row, Diane Richardson at the table in front of them. Across the aisle, Thomas Brennan III sat with his team of lawyers, 4 of them, all in dark suits that probably cost more than Margaret's first car. The judge, a woman in her 60s named Patricia Holloway, entered from her chambers. Everyone stood. Judge Holloway had a reputation, Diane had told them, for being fair but impatient with nonsense. She didn't suffer fools or time-wasters. The hearing began with Thomas's lead attorney, a man named Charles Prescott, making his opening argument. His voice was confident, practiced, the kind that expected to win. Your Honor, the facts are simple. Arthur Brennan died intestate regarding the substantial assets discovered by the defendants. While a will existed leaving surface property to Howard Jensen, the valuable collection was never mentioned, never properly inventoried, and never subject to estate tax or probate. This suggests either fraud or incompetence in the execution of Mr. Brennan's estate. Margaret's hands clenched in her lap. Prescott continued. Furthermore, Arthur Brennan's mental state at the time of his death was questionable at best. A man who builds an underground fortress and hides a fortune worth hundreds of millions was clearly suffering from paranoid delusions. Any distribution of his assets should be reviewed by this court with an eye toward the rightful heirs, his family, including my client. When Prescott sat down, Diane stood. She was calm, collected, and when she spoke, her voice cut through the courtroom like a blade. Your Honor, this is a transparent attempt to overturn a legal inheritance based on nothing more than greed and regret. Arthur Brennan was of sound mind throughout his life. He was a successful architect, a shrewd investor, and a man who chose to protect his assets from the very family members now claiming they deserve them. Diane placed a document on the table. I've submitted to the court Arthur Brennan's medical records, obtained through proper channels with court approval. They show no diagnosis of mental illness, no treatment for paranoia or delusions. He was physically healthy until his death from natural causes at age 48. She paused, letting that sink in. As for the claim that the vault was never properly included in his estate, that's because Arthur Brennan chose not to include it. He deliberately concealed it, not from the government or the courts, but from his family, a family that had spent decades harassing him, threatening him, and attempting to seize his assets through fraudulent legal claims. Diane pulled out another stack of papers. I've also submitted correspondence between Arthur Brennan and Thomas Brennan Sr., the petitioner's grandfather. In these letters, dating from 1953 through 1961, we see a pattern of intimidation, threats, and baseless accusations of theft. Arthur Brennan had every right to leave his assets to whomever he chose, and he did. Through legal inheritance, those assets now belong to Margaret and Harold Jensen. Judge Holloway reviewed the documents in silence. The courtroom was so quiet Margaret could hear the clock ticking on the wall. Finally, the judge looked up. Mr. Prescott, does your client have any documentation suggesting he had a relationship with Arthur Brennan? Any correspondence? Any evidence of familial connection beyond the genealogical record? Prescott stood. Your Honor, the lack of relationship is precisely the point. Arthur Brennan cut off his family unjustly. Judge Holloway's expression didn't change. Did your client or his father ever attempt to reconcile with Arthur Brennan? To reach out, to repair the relationship? Prescott hesitated. That's not relevant to the legal question of asset distribution. Judge Holloway's eyes narrowed. I'll decide what's relevant, Counselor. Answer the question. Prescott shuffled papers. There's no record of contact, Your Honor, but that doesn't negate my client's legal claim to a share of the estate. Judge Holloway leaned back in her chair. Let me make sure I understand your argument. Your client's grandfather and great-grandfather spent years harassing Arthur Brennan, accusing him of crimes he didn't commit, attempting to seize his assets through legal intimidation. Arthur Brennan responded by legally protecting his wealth and leaving it to distant relatives who never harassed him. Now, 50 years after Arthur's death, your client appears claiming that he deserves a portion of assets he didn't know existed until 3 months ago, from a man he never met, based solely on a genetic connection to people who made Arthur Brennan's life miserable. Prescott's face reddened. Your Honor, that's a gross oversimplification. No, Mr. Prescott, Judge Holloway said flatly. That's exactly what this is, and I've seen enough. She gathered her papers. The petition is denied. Arthur Brennan had every right to dispose of his assets as he saw fit. The chain of inheritance from Arthur Brennan to Howard Jensen to Margaret and Harold Jensen is legally sound and will not be disturbed by this court. Margaret felt Harold's hand grip hers so tightly it hurt. Thomas Brennan shot to his feet. Your Honor, this is outrageous. We have rights. Judge Holloway's voice was ice. What you have, Mr. Brennan, is a sense of entitlement to money you didn't earn from a man you never knew. This court doesn't reward that. She stood. We're adjourned. The gavel came down like thunder. Margaret couldn't breathe. Harold was shaking beside her, tears streaming down his face. Diane turned around, a rare smile crossing her face. It's over. You won. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed them. Cameras flashed, microphones thrust forward like weapons. Mrs. Jensen, how does it feel to win? Mr. Jensen, what will you do with the money? Are you concerned about Mr. Brennan's appeal? Frank Mercado and his team created a barrier, guiding Margaret and Harold through the crowd to a waiting car. Margaret said nothing, just kept her head down, Harold's hand in hers. They didn't speak until they were safely inside Diane's office an hour later. Diane poured them each a glass of water. Thomas will appeal, she said, but he won't win. Judge Holloway's ruling was thorough and well-reasoned. An appellate court will uphold it. How long? Harold asked, his voice hoarse. Diane considered. 6 months, maybe a year. But you can start moving forward now. The court has recognized your ownership. That means you can insure it, secure it properly, and yes, begin liquidating assets if you choose. Margaret and Harold looked at each other. We want to start the foundation, Margaret said. We've been talking about it every night. We want to move forward. Diane nodded, pulling out a legal pad. Then, let's discuss structure. Over the next 3 hours, they laid the groundwork. The Brennan Foundation would be a private charitable foundation, properly structured to maximize impact and minimize tax burden. Margaret and Harold would keep enough to secure their future, pay off their debts, buy a modest but comfortable home, maybe $10 million total. The rest, nearly $200 million, would go into the foundation. Diane walked them through the process. You'll need a board of directors, at least 3 people. You'll need to define your mission, establish giving criteria, and set up proper accounting and oversight. It's a lot of work. We'll figure it out, Margaret said with a certainty that surprised even herself. Diane smiled. I believe you will. I'll draft the incorporation documents and get the process started. In the meantime, you'll need to start thinking about liquidation strategy. Some assets, like the bearer bonds and cash, can be converted quickly. Others, like the art and rare coins, should go through proper auction channels to maximize value. Margaret thought of the Rothko, worth $12 million. The idea of selling it felt strange, almost sacrilegious. Could we keep one painting? She asked suddenly. Diane looked up. Which one? The Rothko, Margaret said. Or maybe one of the smaller ones. I want something to remember Arthur by. Something beautiful that he loved. Diane's expression softened. Of course. In fact, keeping 1 or 2 pieces for yourselves is perfectly reasonable. They're gifts from the estate to you personally. Harold reached over and squeezed Margaret's hand. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of activity. Appraisers, auction houses, bank meetings, legal filings. Margaret felt like she was living someone else's life. One afternoon, she stood in the vault supervising as workers carefully crated the art collection for transport to an auction house in New York. Catherine Chen, the art appraiser, had returned to oversee the process. Each painting was wrapped in special material, cushioned, secured. As they lifted the Rothko, Margaret felt a pang of loss. Catherine noticed. Having second thoughts? Margaret shook her head. No. It's just strange. 3 months ago, Harold and I were worried about property taxes. Now I'm watching a $12 million painting get packed up for auction. Catherine smiled gently. Wealth changes everything. The key is not letting it change who you are. Margaret thought about that as the workers continued their careful labor. Was she still the same person? She didn't feel the same. The fear that had defined her life for so long, the constant worry about money, about survival, about losing everything, had been replaced by something else. Responsibility. Purpose. That evening, Margaret and Harold drove into town for the first time in weeks. They'd been avoiding it, afraid of the stares, the questions, the judgment. But they couldn't hide forever. They stopped at Thompson's Feed and Supply to pick up some items for the house. The moment they walked in, the store went quiet. Every head turned. Jerry Thompson, the owner, looked up from behind the counter. His expression was unreadable. Margaret felt her stomach clench. Then Jerry smiled. Heard you beat that city lawyer in court. Congratulations. Margaret blinked, surprised. You're not angry? Angry? Jerry shook his head. Maggie, you and Harold have lived here your whole lives. Worked hard, never caused trouble, helped folks when you could. You inherited something and fought to keep it. Nothing wrong with that. An older woman Margaret recognized from church approached. I think it's wonderful, she said, and I heard you're starting a foundation to help people. Is that true? Word had spread then. Margaret nodded slowly. We're going to try. The woman's eyes filled with tears. My grandson needs surgery. Insurance won't cover it. We've been trying to raise money, but it's been so hard. She hesitated. Is there any way your foundation could help? Margaret felt something crack open in her chest. The foundation isn't officially running yet, but yes. Once it is, that's exactly the kind of thing we want to help with. The woman grabbed Margaret's hand. Bless you both. As they left the store 20 minutes later, Harold was quiet. Margaret looked at him. You okay? He nodded, but his eyes were wet. Did you see her face? When you said we'd help? Margaret had. It was hope. Pure, desperate, beautiful hope. We're doing the right thing, Harold said quietly. I know we are. Over the next 3 months, the liquidation process moved forward. The art collection sold at auction for $62 million, even more than estimated. The rare coins brought in $14 million. Bearer bonds were redeemed for their full value. Gold was sold in carefully managed lots to avoid flooding the market. By early spring, the foundation had $187 million in liquid assets, properly invested, generating income, ready to be deployed. Margaret and Harold hired a small staff, an executive director named Patricia Morales, who had run non-profit organizations for 20 years, an accountant, and 2 program coordinators. They rented office space in Billings and got to work. The mission statement was simple. The Brennan Foundation exists to provide emergency financial assistance to individuals and families facing medical crises, unexpected hardship, or economic challenges beyond their control. Priority will be given to residents of Montana and surrounding states. The first grant went to the woman from church, $23,000 for her grandson's surgery. Margaret hand-delivered the check. The woman collapsed into her arms, sobbing. The second grant went to a family whose home had burned down, leaving them with nothing. $15,000 for temporary housing and essentials. The third went to a veteran struggling with medical bills from a service-related injury. $32,000 to clear his debt and give him breathing room. Word spread fast. Applications poured in, single mothers needing help with childcare so they could work, elderly people choosing between medication and food, families crushed by medical debt, students who couldn't afford college, small business owners facing bankruptcy. Margaret and Harold reviewed every application personally at first, reading each story, understanding each need. It was overwhelming. It was heartbreaking, and it was the most meaningful thing either of them had ever done. One afternoon, 6 months after the foundation officially launched, Margaret sat in the office reading an application from a man in Great Falls. He was a mechanic, laid off when the shop closed, now facing eviction with 2 kids and a pregnant wife. Margaret saw herself in that application, saw the fear, the desperation, the weight of trying to provide for people you love when the world keeps knocking you down. She approved the grant. $8,000. Enough for rent, food, and a cushion while he found new work. Harold found her crying at her desk. Maggie, what's wrong? She held up the application. This could have been us, Harold. 3 months earlier, and this would have been us. Harold read it, then pulled up a chair beside her. But it wasn't us, and now we can help people for whom it is. That's the gift Arthur gave us. Not just money, but the ability to change lives. Margaret wiped her eyes. Sometimes I think about him, alone in that vault, convinced everyone was out to get him. If he could see what we're doing, do you think he'd be proud? Harold thought about that. I think he'd be grateful. Grateful that his fortune finally means something. As the foundation grew, Margaret and Harold's lives transformed in ways they never expected. They bought a modest house in Billings, 3 bedrooms, a small garden, nothing extravagant. They paid off all their debts. Harold got the medical treatment he needed for his Parkinson's, accessing specialists and medications they could never have afforded before. But the real change wasn't in their circumstances. It was in them. Margaret stood taller now. The worry lines around her eyes had softened. She'd found purpose in the foundation's work, spending her days reading applications, meeting recipients, seeing the direct impact of their giving. Harold's tremors hadn't disappeared, but his spirit had strengthened. He worked with Patricia to develop programs for veterans, using his own experience to understand their needs. They weren't rich in the way Thomas Brennan III had been rich, drowning in luxury and entitlement. They were rich in purpose, and that made all the difference. 1 year after finding the vault, Margaret received a phone call from a reporter at Montana Public Radio. They wanted to do a feature story on the foundation. Margaret hesitated. "We're not looking for publicity," she told the reporter. Her name was Amanda Reeves, and her voice was warm. "I understand. But your story is important. People need to know that kindness like this still exists, that ordinary people can do extraordinary things." Margaret agreed to an interview on the condition that it focus on the foundation's work, not on the treasure itself. Amanda showed up at their home on a crisp autumn morning with a microphone and recording equipment. They sat in the living room, coffee brewing in the kitchen, as Amanda asked questions. "What made you decide to give away most of the fortune?" Margaret thought carefully. Arthur Brennan spent his whole life protecting his wealth because he was afraid. Harold and I decided we didn't want to live that way. We wanted the money to do good. "Weren't you tempted to keep it?" Amanda asked. "To live a life of luxury?" Harold answered that one. "We're 75 and 72 years old. What would we do with $200 million? Buy bigger houses we can't clean? Cars we can barely drive?" He shook his head. "We have everything we need. Other people don't. That's where the money belongs." The interview aired 2 weeks later. Within days, it had gone viral. Major news networks picked it up. Good Morning America called. The Today Show wanted them on. Margaret and Harold declined most of it, uncomfortable with the attention. But the story spread anyway. And with it came more applications to the foundation. Thousands of them. People from across the country writing in, sharing their struggles, asking for help. It was too much for their small staff to handle. Margaret and Harold realized they needed to expand, hire more people, develop better systems. Patricia Morales helped them restructure, bringing in grant managers, financial analysts, impact assessors. Within 18 months, the Brennan Foundation had a full staff of 23 people, had distributed over $38 million in grants, and had helped more than 4,000 families. But Margaret never lost sight of the personal connection. Once a month, she insisted on hand-delivering a grant check to someone local, meeting them face-to-face, hearing their story. One cold December afternoon, Margaret drove out to a small ranch outside of Helena. A family named the Torres family had applied for help after their father suffered a stroke and couldn't work. They were facing foreclosure on their property. Margaret parked in front of a weathered farmhouse and walked to the door. A teenage girl answered, maybe 16, with tired eyes and calloused hands. "You're Mrs. Jensen?" she asked quietly. Margaret nodded. "I'm here to see your mother." The girl led her inside to a small kitchen where a woman in her early 40s sat at the table, surrounded by bills and paperwork. Her name was Carmen Torres, and when she saw Margaret, she stood quickly, wiping her eyes. "I'm sorry, the house is a mess. We weren't expecting—" "It's fine," Margaret said gently. "Please sit." Carmen sat back down, hands trembling. "I don't know what to say. When we got the letter saying we'd been approved, I thought it was a mistake." Margaret pulled an envelope from her bag and set it on the table. $53,000. Enough to clear your mortgage arrears and give you 6 months of living expenses while your husband recovers. Carmen stared at the envelope like it might disappear. Tears streamed down her face. "Why?" she whispered. "Why would you do this for people you don't even know?" Margaret thought of herself a year and a half ago, standing in her own kitchen, surrounded by bills she couldn't pay, wondering if they'd lose everything. "Because I know what it's like to be where you are, and because someone gave us a gift, now we're passing it on." Carmen broke down completely, sobbing into her hands. Her daughter wrapped her arms around her mother, crying too. Margaret sat with them until the tears subsided, until Carmen could breathe again, until hope had replaced despair in that small kitchen. When Margaret left an hour later, the sun was setting over the Montana hills, painting the sky in shades of gold and purple. She sat in her car for a long moment, watching the light fade, thinking about Arthur Brennan. He'd built his fortress to keep the world out. But through Margaret and Harold, his wealth was now building bridges, bringing people together, lifting them up. That night, Margaret told Harold about the Torres family. He listened quietly, his hand covering hers. "We're doing good work, Maggie." She nodded. "Arthur's money is finally being used the way it should have been all along, not to build walls, but to tear them down." 2 years after finding the vault, Margaret received a call from Diane Richardson. Thomas Brennan III's final appeal had been denied. The legal battle was officially over. Margaret thanked Diane and hung up. She told Harold the news. He smiled, but it was tinged with sadness. "I almost feel sorry for him." Margaret raised an eyebrow. "Almost?" Harold shrugged. "He spent 2 years fighting for money that was never his, hired lawyers that cost him a fortune, and got nothing. Meanwhile, we spent that same time giving away money, and we've never been happier. Ironic, isn't it?" Margaret thought about that. The thing Thomas didn't understand was that the treasure wasn't the gold or the art. It was the choice. The choice to be generous instead of greedy, to be open instead of closed, to trust instead of fear. "Arthur never had that choice," Margaret said quietly. "Or he did, and he was too afraid to make it. But he gave it to us, and we chose differently." One spring morning, 3 years after their discovery, Margaret and Harold drove out to Whitehall. They hadn't been back to the property in months. The vault was now empty, its contents liquidated and distributed to people who needed them. But the structure remained, perfectly preserved, a testament to Arthur Brennan's architectural genius and tragic isolation. They walked down the stone steps one more time, flashlights cutting through the darkness. The rooms echoed with emptiness. The shelves that once held gold now held nothing but dust. The cases that contained priceless art stood open and bare. Margaret ran her hand along the smooth stone wall. "What should we do with this place?" Harold looked around. "I've been thinking about that. What if we turned it into something? A museum?" Margaret asked. Harold nodded. "A museum and education center, about Arthur's life, about the dangers of isolation and fear, about the power of generosity. We could bring students here, teach them about architecture, about history, about making good choices with whatever wealth they have, whether it's money or time or talent." Margaret felt excitement building. The Arthur Brennan Legacy Center. Harold smiled. Exactly. Over the next year, they made it happen. They hired architects to reinforce the structure, add proper lighting, install climate control and safety features. They commissioned exhibits about Arthur's life, his architectural achievements, his tragic isolation. They created educational programs for schools, and at the center of it all, in the main vault room, they installed a simple bronze plaque. It read, "Arthur Brennan, 1928 to 1976. Architect, visionary, and ultimately, a reminder that our greatest treasures are not the things we hoard, but the lives we touch." May we all choose connection over isolation, generosity over fear, and love over gold. Margaret and Harold Jensen, stewards of his legacy. The Arthur Brennan Legacy Center opened on a bright May morning. Over 300 people attended: students, teachers, foundation recipients, community members. Margaret gave a short speech, her voice steady and strong. 3 years ago, my husband and I were struggling. We were facing foreclosure, drowning in medical bills, and wondering how we'd survive. Then we inherited a piece of land and found something that changed our lives forever. She paused, looking out at the crowd. But it wasn't the gold or the art or the money that changed us. It was the choice we had to make. Would we become like Arthur, protecting our wealth out of fear? Or would we honor his legacy by doing what he couldn't, sharing it with others? We chose to share, and in doing so, we found something worth more than all the treasure in that vault. We found purpose. We found community. We found joy. Harold joined her, his hand steady on her shoulder despite the Parkinson's. To everyone who's been helped by the Brennan Foundation, you are Arthur's true legacy. You are proof that wealth means nothing unless it improves lives. To the students here today, remember that you don't need millions to make a difference. You just need to see someone who needs help and decide to act. That's the real treasure. The applause was thunderous. Afterward, people lined up to thank them, to share their stories, to express gratitude. The woman whose grandson had the surgery was there, the boy healthy and running around with other children. The Torres family came, their ranch saved, their father recovered and walking with a cane, but walking nonetheless. Dozens of others, each one a life changed, a future secured, hope restored. As the sun began to set, Margaret and Harold stood at the entrance to the vault, now a museum, and looked out over the land. The same land where 3 years ago they'd stumbled over a moss-covered stone and changed their lives forever. "Maggie," Harold said softly, "do you ever wonder what would have happened if we hadn't gone looking? If we just declined the inheritance and walked away?" Margaret thought about that. Sometimes. But then I remember we didn't find the treasure by accident. We found it because we were desperate enough to look. Most people would have walked away. They almost had. But something, fate or stubbornness or sheer necessity, had pushed them forward. And that choice, that single decision to investigate a worthless piece of land, had led to everything else. The foundation had now distributed over $90 million. Thousands of families had been helped, lives had been saved, futures secured, dreams made possible. And it all started because 2 broke, desperate people refused to give up. As darkness fell, Margaret and Harold walked back to their car. Tomorrow they'd return to Billings, to the foundation office, to the next stack of applications, to the next person who needed help. It was exhausting work, but it was good work, the best work they'd ever done. 6 months later, Margaret received an unexpected letter. It was from a law firm in Boston, but not Thomas Brennan's lawyers. Different firm, different tone. Inside was a short note and a check. "Dear Mrs. Jensen, my name is Elizabeth Brennan. Cooper. I am Thomas Brennan, the third's younger sister. I only recently learned about the legal battle my brother waged against you, and I want to apologize. My brother's behavior was shameful. You and your husband have done more to honor our great-great-uncle's memory than our family ever did. I'm enclosing a donation to the Brennan Foundation. It's not much, just $50,000, but I hope it helps someone. Please keep doing what you're doing. You've reminded me that family isn't about blood, it's about values. Sincerely, Elizabeth Brennan, Cooper." Margaret read the letter twice, tears blurring her vision. She called Harold over and read it aloud. When she finished, Harold was quiet for a long moment. Even Arthur's family is starting to understand. Margaret folded the letter carefully. Maybe that's the real legacy. Not the money, but the example. Showing people there's a better way to live. That night, Margaret pulled out Arthur's journal one more time. She'd kept it, along with one small painting, a landscape Arthur had purchased in 1958. It hung in their bedroom now, a reminder of where they'd come from and who they'd become. She opened the journal to the last page, where Arthur had written his final entry. "If someone finds this after I'm gone, I hope they're different than me. I hope they use it for something good." Margaret picked up a pen and wrote below Arthur's words, "We found it, Arthur, and we did exactly what you hoped. Thank you for trusting that someday someone would. You weren't wrong about the world being full of people who take, but you were wrong about it being only those people. There are also people who give, and now, because of you, we're two of them." Margaret Jensen, October 24, 2025. 5 years after finding the vault, Margaret and Harold attended a gala in Billings. The event was a fundraiser for other Montana nonprofits, and the Brennan Foundation had been invited to participate. Margaret wore a simple dress, Harold a suit he'd owned for 20 years. They felt out of place among the wealthy donors in their designer clothes and expensive jewelry. But then something happened. Person after person approached them, not to ask for money, but to thank them. A woman whose daughter's cancer treatment had been funded by the foundation hugged Margaret and wept. A man whose small business had been saved by a foundation. Grant shook Harold's hand so vigorously, Harold's shoulder hurt for a week. A teacher whose entire classroom had received school supplies and winter coats through a foundation program brought Margaret a handmade card signed by every student. By the end of the night, Margaret and Harold stood surrounded by people whose lives they'd touched. And Margaret realized something profound. They weren't out of place here. They belonged here more than anyone, because they understood what these people had been through. They knew what it meant to struggle, to worry, to lie awake at night wondering how you'd survive. And they'd chosen to use their incredible fortune not to escape that world, but to reach back and pull others out of it. As they drove home that night, Harold said, "I never thought at 77 I'd be doing the most important work of my life." Margaret smiled. "I never thought at 74 I'd finally understand what it means to be rich." "It's not about what you have, Harold. It's about what you give. And how it changes the people you give to," Harold added. "And how it changes you." Margaret thought about that. She wasn't the same woman who'd stood in her kitchen 3 years ago, terrified of losing everything. That woman had been small, afraid, focused only on survival. The woman she was now still worked hard, still worried sometimes, still felt the weight of responsibility, but she also felt joy, purpose, fulfillment. She felt like her life finally meant something. They pulled into their driveway and sat in the car for a moment, the engine ticking as it cooled. Harold reached over and took her hand. "Thank you, Maggie." "For what?" "For not letting me say no, for pushing us to investigate that property, for believing we could handle what we found." Margaret squeezed his hand. "We were meant to find it, Harold. I really believe that. Arthur was meant to leave it. Uncle Howard was meant to pass it to us, and we were meant to do exactly what we've done." Inside their modest home, Margaret made tea while Harold checked the foundation's email. There were always messages, always more requests, always people in need. It never stopped. But that was okay. They didn't need it to stop. They just needed to keep going, one person at a time, one grant at a time, one life at a time. Harold called from the office. "Maggie, come look at this." Margaret brought 2 cups of tea and peered over his shoulder. On the screen was an email from a young woman named Sarah Chen. She was 23, studying to be a nurse, but had run out of money for tuition. She'd applied to the foundation, hoping for help. "I know there are people who need it more," she wrote, "but if there's any way you could help me finish school, I promise I'll spend my career helping others. That's all I want to do." Margaret read the email twice. Approve it. The full amount for her remaining tuition, books, living expenses. Harold looked up at her. "That's almost $40,000. Margaret nodded. And when she graduates, she'll help thousands of patients over her career. That's the best investment we could make. Harold smiled and typed the approval. Another life changed, another future secured. As Margaret climbed into bed that night, she thought about Arthur Brennan one more time. She pictured him in his underground vault, surrounded by treasure but completely alone. And she thought about herself and Harold, living in a modest house with modest means, but surrounded by community, purpose, and love. "We broke your curse, Arthur," she whispered into the darkness. "We took your treasure and turned it into connection instead of isolation, into hope instead of fear. And somehow, through that, we found our own treasure, the kind that can't be measured or appraised or locked in a vault, the treasure of a life well lived." Harold's soft snoring filled the room. Margaret closed her eyes, feeling peace settle over her like a blanket. Tomorrow she'd wake up and read more applications. She'd approve more grants. She'd meet more people whose lives were being transformed by Arthur's legacy. And she'd thank him, silently, for the gift he didn't even know he'd given. Not the gold or the art or the bonds, but the opportunity to become something more than she'd ever imagined. The story of Margaret and Harold Jensen didn't end with finding the treasure. It began there. Because the real story was never about the fortune they discovered. It was about the choice they made with it. Anyone can stumble upon wealth through inheritance, luck, or circumstance. But not everyone has the courage to use it wisely. Not everyone can resist the temptation to hoard it, protect it, let it isolate them from the world. Margaret and Harold proved that ordinary people, given extraordinary means, can do extraordinary good. They proved that the greatest legacy isn't what you leave behind in a vault, but what you build in the lives of others. And in a small underground museum outside Whitehall, Montana, where students now come to learn about architecture and generosity and the power of choice, Arthur Brennan's true fortune finally rests. Not in gold bars or rare paintings, but in the thousands of lives touched, the futures secured, the hope restored. Because for Arthur, whose fear built walls, for Margaret and Harold, whose courage tore them down, and for everyone they helped along the way, the greatest treasure was never buried. It was always meant to be shared. The end. Up next, 2 more powerful stories are waiting for you. Click to keep discovering, and don't forget to hit subscribe if you believe the true measure of wealth is what you give away, not what you keep.